Tomorrow night, the architect Eva Jerichner brings us right up into the 80s and gives us a guided tour of the Schlumberger Cambridge Research Centre, built in 1984. That's at the same time tomorrow, 10:20. In 55 minutes, some 10 minutes later than billed, we'll be looking at the increasing impacts of television on American presidential campaigns over the 30 years up to the election of Ronald Reagan. And that's here on BBC Two after an extended edition of Newsnight.
Good evening. Dozens of new television stations, hundreds of new radio stations, more choice, yet at the same time the protection of viewers and listeners from shoddy wares. That's the prospect offered for Britain into the 21st century by the Home Secretary today as he unveiled the government's white paper on broadcasting. But the opposition fear less real diversity, lower standards and rich pickings for the media barons. I'll be discussing the issues with the BBC Director General Michael Checkland, Richard Dunn of the ITV companies, and the Sunday Times editor Andrew Neil, one of the leading advocates of deregulation. The Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, tries to defuse the row over means-tested state benefits for pensioners. He says he was misreported by the Sunday newspapers. We'll be examining his controversial lobby briefing and what it might now mean for pensioners.
Also tonight, from Washington, the prospects for tomorrow's presidential election. Supporters of the underdog, Michael Dukakis, say that a late surge could still produce a surprise victory for their man. But the opinion polls and the pundits agree it's George Bush who will succeed President Reagan in the White House. We will be assessing the claims and counterclaims on this eve of poll, and Charles Wheeler will be tracing the origins of Mr. Bush's much criticised negative campaign tactics.
Broadcasting in Britain is both an industry on the brink of enormous technological change and a central feature in the daily cultural life of millions of people. The government today outlined how it plans to open up the airwaves and offer viewers and listeners more choice while maintaining standards. But the opposition and many broadcasters remain unconvinced, fearing that more means worse. The Home Secretary, Douglas Hurd, announcing details of his much-leaked white paper to the House of Commons, said he was offering a substantial liberalisation, particularly of the ITV system. The viewer, rather than the regulator, would be relied upon to sustain range and quality of programming, choosing the best from existing and new channels, some land-based, others broadcast by satellite.
We aim to ensure that viewers and listeners have greater freedom of choice from a more varied output of programme, including programmes of high quality. Our television has a deservedly high reputation in the world, and we expect that reputation to grow with the opportunities which are now in sight.
But the shadow Home Secretary, Roy Hattersley, claimed the government, obsessed by the idea of a free market, had the wrong interests at heart.
Mr. Speaker, this white paper reflects commercial values rather than broadcasting values, as is to be expected from a policy which owes more to the Department of Industry than it does to the Home Office. It pretends to offer choice. In fact, many of the new channels will do no more than offer vast profits to the tycoons of international television. It is a giant retreat from the concept of public sector broadcasting. Its result will be less diversity and lower standards.
And Mr. Hattersley's fears were echoed by the SLD's Home Affairs spokesman, Robert McLennan.
We, my right honourable and honourable friends, greatly welcome the extension of consumer choice that is implicit in the new broadcasting technologies and in increasing competition. But does he also recognise that we are extremely concerned that he has not recognised that this increasing multiplicity of channels will not of itself ensure that the public enjoys the quality and variety which we have had in this country and which is the envy of the world?
Most of the details in today's announcement came as no surprise after a series of leaks over the past few months. The proposals in the White Paper will go before Parliament next year, and it's likely they'll become law sometime in 1990. The main proposals include a fifth land-based commercial television channel to start broadcasting from 1993, with the possibility of a sixth to follow. 2 more satellite channels on top of those already planned by 1990. More local channels. The ITV franchises are to be put out to competitive tender, but only to those who can pass a quality test. ITV would be known as Channel 3. Channel 3 could be sure that at least one body would be equipped to provide it with a news service, as ITN does now. The IBA and the Cable Authority are to be replaced by an independent television commission, a regulator, but with, Mr. Hurd said, a lighter touch. Advertising on Channel 4 is to be sold separately from that on Channel 3, but Channel 4's remit to provide diverse programmes is to be maintained. 3 new national commercial radio stations and possibly several hundred local stations. And the BBC is being asked to introduce subscription for some of its services, pending the eventual replacement of the licence fee. Well, today's white paper is the government's attempt to come to terms with the new technology and answer criticism from advertisers and others that British broadcasting is a cosy duopoly between the BBC and ITV. Our political correspondent Nick Clark now reports on the political pressures which lay behind what Douglas Hurd today called this enabling framework for the broadcasters of the 90s and beyond.
Yes, I think it's a very good document. I think it strikes the balance very well. But quite how, you'll just have to wait and see.
If all the leaks were to be believed, waiting and seeing wouldn't produce much new information at all. Yet, as it turned out, Mr. Hurd did have some surprises up his sleeve, and there was considerable interest too in whether the white paper would expose any hints of the policy differences within the government on the question of broadcasting policy.
All governments seem to be fascinated by broadcasting, and if you look at the history of broadcasting, every 10 or 15 years they pull up the roots to have a look and see, and some of the things they decide are not all that sensible. They're fascinated, of course, because they think broadcasting has got such enormous power in the democratic process. But in this case, the Prime Minister is looking really, and has been looking at all institutions in British society. To some extent, in this administration, broadcasting has simply come to the top of the list. British Telecom has been privatised, other things have been done, now it's broadcasting's turn to suffer.
The last pulling up of the roots came 2 years ago with the report of Professor Alan Peacock's committee. Many ministers felt that the BBC, secure its licence fee income, needed shaking up, perhaps by introducing advertising. But the committee rejected such a change and drew up instead a blueprint for the whole future of broadcasting. The report got a cool reception. But now many of the Peacock proposals, opening out ITV franchises to tender, for instance, figure prominently in the white paper.
The last time I appeared on this programme, I felt it was rather like a repeat of the martyrdom of St. Sebastian. All the arrows were piercing my breast and other parts of my anatomy, and somehow or other we've managed to pull them out and throw them back.
And this time it's the ITV companies which have found themselves in the firing line. They've always had, by popular repute, a licence to print money with what amounts to monopoly control of lucrative television advertising. Professor Peacock suggested 2 years ago that franchises should be thrown open to the highest bidder. It's easy to see why the idea should appeal to the Prime Minister, who has a deep ideological mistrust of monopolies. She's fascinated by the new broadcasting technologies and the opportunities they offer. Her instinct is to allow them to develop in as free a market as possible. Mrs. Thatcher herself chose to chair a ministerial committee on the subject, which, as well as Douglas Hurd, has included the Chancellor, who wants to see a substantial increase in the levy ITV companies pay to the Treasury, and Lord Young, whose Department of Trade and Industry wants to promote and protect the interests of new technology companies.
Get your Single Market Action Pack. Phone 01200 1992.
And Lord Young has another axe to grind. His department is currently running a campaign on the subject of Europe in 1992, and Lord Young is not happy about the £7 million advertising bill. It's a view with which the rest of the advertising industry sympathises.
Costs have increased so much for advertisers. I mean, just in the last 2 years, they've gone up by over 40%. And at the same time, and one of the engines that's been driving that cost increase has been the decline, not just in audiences in total, but the decline in really the standard and quality of the audience, and that ITV in particular has gone more and more down market and got older and older.
A good deal of progress has been made.
To Douglas Hurd and his officials fell the task of coordinating these varied complaints and aspirations into a coherent formula. And by some accounts, the Home Office found itself fighting a rearguard action against free marketeers who wanted to abandon controls and regulations. But in Channel 4, at least, all parties could recognise a broadcasting system that's working well. They might not agree on its financing. The white paper suggests a range of options to replace its present funding by ITV, everything from pure privatisation to a link-up with the new Channel 5. But the government clearly believes there are lessons to be learned. Unlike the BBC and the ITV companies, Channel 4 has few expensive overheads. A staff of just 300, one small studio, and no full-time cameraman. In other words, Channel 4 is like a publishing house of the air. It simply commissions programmes from an independent sector which has grown up to meet that particular need. It's a pattern the government would like to see applied to ITV companies and eventually perhaps to the BBC. The days of vertical integration, when one organisation controls every stage of planning, production and transmission, may well be numbered. For the present ITV companies, the implications are serious. When their franchises run out, they'll find themselves bidding in an open auction for the right to continue in existence. Some areas, like Border, with small scattered populations, will inevitably be less attractive business propositions, and free market economists say services may have to be poorer as a result.
You would expect in the rural areas to have a type of service that catered for the locality, but if seen by a metropolitan television channel, they would say that's amateurish. You know, they talk about sheep and how fast the wheat's growing, and a sort of chap in his barber, you know, reading the news. It wouldn't be acceptable in the metropolitan area, but that type of quality variation would exist. It would be a cheap-run television. And people would say that that is a fallen standard, but it's offering the service that is economically sensible in those particular areas.
My view is that television is something that should be equally available, the length and breadth of the country, at the highest level and at the most entertaining level, wherever you are. What this might do is to say, it's okay if you're in big cities, you can have all sorts of services. But if you live out in the regions, out in the country, out in the heart of England, out in the Highlands of Scotland, out in the West Country, you're going to have a much lesser service. Or you're going to have to pay a great deal more for it. Now, I deplore that.
That's just one of the complicating factors in the launch of a new broadcasting age.
Sky, first in Europe.
Satellite and cable technology, as Mr. Hurd pointed out today, promise a dozen television channels jostling for a share of the audience and a share of the advertising cake. The government likes the idea of the wider choice that this implies, and has clearly been influenced in its policy planning by the views of men like Sir Geoffrey Sterling. The chairman of P&O, a free market enthusiast, was brought in by Lord Young as a special advisor, and he came to play an important role.
Earlier this year, there was this astonishing happening where Sir Geoffrey Sterling was hosting breakfasts for the great and the good from the broadcasting world, so that the chairman and director general of the BBC had to troop along to have breakfast with Sir Geoffrey Sterling to discuss broadcasting. And people like Robert Maxwell, Rupert Murdoch, all of these people had their eggs and bacon too.
Sir Geoffrey Sterling was one of those who turned up at a hotel in Berkshire one morning in July. The idea was to take the key players away from their Whitehall desks long enough to get to grips with the competing demands within the broadcasting business. It was in this room that the brainstorming session took place. There were Douglas Hurd and Timothy Renton from the Home Office, Lord Young from the DTI, and Brian Griffiths, Special Advisor to the Prime Minister. There was a delegation from the Treasury and a bevy of other civil servants, more than 20 people in all. They had a working lunch, a cold buffet, and emerged after some 5 hours of discussions with the framework of today's white paper. It became known in Whitehall afterwards as the Silchester Summit. The result inevitably was a compromise, and one which radical economists believe ducks the real issues.
This is trying to protect the institutions that exist in the present system, which is inherently uncompetitive, and transfer them over to a competitive world, in which the government, at the end of the day, has very little say in. With the new technology, with satellite television beaming in from outside the country, with rapid technological advances, there's no reason to assume that the British government knows better.
But the shape of television is bound to change. What, for instance, will happen to more serious ITV programmes, which are comparatively expensive to produce? Professor Alan Peacock, 2 years ago, suggested an Arts Council of the Air to fund public service broadcasting across a range of channels. He's disappointed that this notion doesn't figure in the white paper.
a large part of the report with which my name's associated is concerned with how do you preserve public service broadcasting. It's to say the programs requiring active listening, the cultural programs we all like to see, and the answer is it has to be done by public subsidy.
I think the consequence of the government's proposals will be to hit all serious programming, including extended news and current affairs. Those programs, like all serious programming, depend on resources and proper investment in them. If you have cheap news, you will tend to have uncritical news. You will tend to have unimaginative treatment of the news. Now, the government may welcome that. They may feel that less serious treatment of what they're doing may be of benefit to them in the short term. In the long run, however, I think we will all be the losers, all of us who play a part in the democratic system.
Peter Mandelson ending that report by Nick Clark. Well, joining me now to discuss the issues are Michael Checkland, the Director General of BBC, Andrew Neil, the editor of the Sunday Times, who's an advocate of more choice and deregulation, and Richard Dunn for the ITV companies. Mr. Dunn, why should the ITV companies complain when the Home Secretary is saying he's offering the viewers more choice and protection from shoddy wares, as he puts it?
Well, we haven't complained, not loudly yet anyway, and we're not against more choice. In fact, we're rather in favour of more choice, and many of us, almost all of us, are investing in more choice. Nor are we against competition. But what we do wonder, having received this document today, which is a complicated document, it's heavy on detail and perhaps lightish on analysis, is whether the government has got the balance right between providing that wider choice and maintaining high standards of broadcasting which the British public have traditionally enjoyed.
But in essence, you don't see any reason why more television should be worse television?
No, I think a lot more television, 50 or 50 channels, is likely to have a higher amount of poor television programmes within it. I think that's pretty obvious to everybody.
Michael Checkland, should the BBC, in Douglas Hurd's words, be reasonably well satisfied with what's come out in the White Paper today?
I think we're very pleased that the government have recognised the public service broadcasting role of the BBC in the new competitive environment. And we're pleased to see words which ask us to concentrate on quality of programming, range of quality, diversity of programming, because that is how we see the BBC's role, and we're delighted to see it confirmed today.
Andrew Neil, Roy Hattersley says that standards will inevitably fall, that more does mean worse, and that we're going to end up with lowest common denominator television.
Well, of course, not for the first time. Roy Hattersley doesn't know what he's talking about. He's always had this antediluvian view of television because he doesn't watch it, as most politicians don't. Let's first of all take it for a start. This is not a free market that's being proposed. It's not a laissez-faire system where people can do what they want. The BBC will continue to be funded by the licence fee for the foreseeable future. 2 channels, national, major element of public service broadcasting there, the most famous in the world. Channel 4 will continue with its special remit to provide programmes of minority interest. The ITV channels will still have to meet quality control criteria, or a yellow card and then a red card will be thrown at them. And there's been I'm amused at Richard Dunn saying, well, we don't want any more competition. There has been a massive propaganda campaign by the ITV companies, which the BBC used to be a part of, but saw the sense of not being anymore, to try and tell us that more means worse. More simply means more. There will be better television and some worse television too. And the idea there'll be no children's programming or no religious programming or no serious news or current affairs is absolute nonsense.
Richard Dunn, a massive propaganda campaign in the defence of your own special interests.
Well, I think the Sunday Times sometimes does put words into other people's mouths. It's not the case. What we've said is that competition, we've actually welcomed the idea of a 5th channel. As soon as the government found the frequencies from some magic bottom drawer for a 5th channel. And we have nothing, I think, to fear from a 5th channel or competition if it's sensibly laid out. What I think is intended to be a problem and a threat to ITV contractors is to have their contracts auctioned. And I think going up for auction in 3.5 years' time is a threat and a problem.
But do you see a general degeneration of standards over the next few years? To pick up the point that Andrew Neil is saying that the ITV companies have made repeatedly in the past, that you really do say that more means worse.
I think that, that the regional services of ITV, which are provided at the moment, if they are all sold at auction, the result of an auction, it's impossible to predict at the moment, but I do think it's putting the services at risk. What I'm saying is not that categorically there will be worse programs, but there may well be as a result.
Andrew Neil auctioning the
It's a better way of doing it than a bunch of people who went to the same schools and the universities getting round the table together and carving it out among themselves. Look at the way TVM originally got the franchise. This at least puts it in the hand of the highest bidder, and the country gets a fair return for what is a scarce commodity, which is spectrum. Now, I don't believe that the quality of British television is nearly as high as people think it is, and particularly on ITV. I don't happen to like snooker or darts, so that therefore means that there's a lot of times on both the BBC and ITV I don't want to watch it. ITV refused to cover the Prime Minister's speech from the Congress, the first time since Churchill that a British Prime Minister had spoken there. Only at the last minute did they decide to take Reagan's Guildhall speech. They didn't, and it's very difficult for ITN to get an extension of coverage at 10:30 at night when there's a major news event. The new formula will allow all news channels to carry all these things. There will be more quality. In America, there's a Disney Channel, which is the best children's channel in the world. Yet one of your spokesmen, Richard, said that in a deregulated environment there would be no children's television. That is a straight lie. There is masses of religious broadcasting in America. There's going to be a huge diversity, and I listen to ITV. It sounds like the House of Lords before the 1832 Reform Act, when we're all going to get the vote. What happens with today's white paper is that the viewers will run the TV system and not a few committees.
Michael Checkland, do you see any decline in standards, and if so, can the BBC stay above it?
I take the view that the new entrants should be given a chance. I think that we saw when ITV was introduced, we all said it would bring down standards. It didn't. When Channel 4 was introduced, we thought it would fail, and it hasn't. And I'm delighted that the remit has been confirmed today. And when we were asked to take in independent producers, we all say they couldn't make programmes, and they can. So my view, I think, is to welcome the remit for Channel 4. I think Channel 5 will be a very successful channel, and I think of high quality. I think the new entrants, there'll be some failures and there'll be some successes. I see no reason why there won't be a good sports channel, why there won't be, as Andrew says, a decent children's service, as there has been in the States. So, but the real test for me is whether the new ITV3 structure is capable of producing the quality of programmes that we want. I'm not talking about the new entrants, I'm talking about the existing companies that Richard represents. And I think the test there is how will the quality checks work. If they work, then we will have more television, and that won't mean worse television.
Mr Dunn, Andrew Neil is making it quite clear that he believes that British television, certainly independent television, is not that good, is not that worth defending.
Well, I think he's getting very steamed up about individual programme items when what we're trying to discuss is a pattern of broadcasting. As the Home Secretary said, this is a revolution. It is a revolution in broadcasting.
But you can't get time for major news stories, he's saying, late at night. You can't get more time for children's
nonsense.
Well, ITN can never get an extension at 10:30 either, and you run the Thames side, and Thames has the network control over it. It's even worse at weekends when LWT does it. You didn't cover the Prime Minister's speech from Congress, which was a major news event, the first British Prime Minister since Churchill. And so I believe, I mean, you've had a huge propaganda campaign to say that your quality is so wonderful. I don't think it is so wonderful. Let some other people have a try. We're not aiming to put you out of business. Let's just have some more people do it.
Richard Dunn?
Well, I don't, and I don't think the viewers of this country equate popularity and quality of programmes with the question of whether or not the Prime Minister's speech was covered on that occasion. I think it's much, much broader issue than that. And I think Michael Checkland is quite right to concentrate on whether the ITV companies in their regions, with their regional base, with a good, strong production sector, can continue to serve regional audiences.
Michael Checkland, is the future of the BBC all that secure, given that the Home Secretary also pointed towards an erosion of the licence fee in the early 1990s, subscription television and so on, and doesn't that mean that BBC is under threat, but not immediately?
It's challenged, but that's not a bad thing for the BBC in any case. We're already operating under the retail price indexed formula, which in itself puts constraints on the BBC, and we've shown that we can cope with that. And I think that as we're asked to look for new sources of finance, we'll show ourselves able to consider ways in which we can do it. We've been leading the way on subscription technology by our proposals for using BBC Two through the night, and we've just introduced a doctor's service for that.
But would you be happy to see the licence fee eventually go and be replaced by subscription or something?
I don't think we're talking, I don't think even Peacock got to the point of saying it would be, that the licence fee would be totally abolished. If you remember, the Peacock Committee report suggested that there should be a subscription mechanism, but it would be supplemented by something like a license fee. And I think that what there needs to be in this country for the kind of programme purposes that the BBC has had confirmed again today, if you're being asked to provide a whole range of quality programmes, then you've got to have a financial mechanism that enables you to do that. I think the licence fee has shown itself very successful in doing that because it has created a relationship between the audience and the programme makers in the BBC.
Andrew Neil, in 10 years' time, what will this brave new world of television look like?
Well, I think a lot of new channels will be around and some will go bust and won't work, and some will succeed. And it's not government policy to make channels win or lose, simply government policy to provide an environment in which we can all have a go. For 50 years, TV in this country has been in the hands of a very small group of people. They are no longer going to dominate. It's going to be far more diversified, and I believe we'll have greater diversity, more channels, and at the end of the day, better television. TV is something the British are actually rather good at.
Richard Dunn, final word, more channels, better diversity, more choice for the viewer.
I very much hope that that is so. I cannot possibly say to Andrew Neil or anybody else that that won't be so. I can't say that quality will disappear, that high standards of broadcasting will go down the pan because we're introducing a whole lot more channels. This is exciting. It's called competition. We're going to get involved in it. There will be more choice for viewers, and I hope that everybody can work together to make sure that the high standards of broadcasting that have been enjoyed won't disappear.
Richard Dunn, Michael Checkland, Andrew Neil, thank you very much. Tomorrow, America's voters go to the polls to elect the successor to Ronald Reagan. Newsnight has followed the campaign from the farms of Iowa through the snows of New Hampshire to its conclusion in Washington, D.C. Donald McCormick is there now watching the final day of campaigning. Donald.
In the final stretch of this campaign, Michael Dukakis and the Democrats have been insisting that they're closing the gap with Vice President George Bush. There has been a narrowing in one opinion poll in particular, and Mr. Dukakis has been attracting huge, enthusiastic crowds in his final frenetic round of campaign rallies. The Democrats are fired with the hope that in 1988, Mr. Dukakis can do what Harry Truman did in 1948, come from behind to achieve a political sensation. But that remains unlikely, although the Bush lead has dwindled to 5% in yesterday's poll for NBC television. 4 others keep the vice president ahead by anything from 9 to 12 points. And 5% would still give Mr. Bush a comfortable victory. Even Mr. Dukakis himself, sacrificing every comfort and most of his sleep to the last lap, seems to acknowledge that the evidence of the polls is against him. Speaking in the key state of Ohio this morning, he urged voters to confound rather than confirm what the pollsters were saying.
Is Ohio going to let the pollsters and the pundits decide this election? No! Or are you going to send a message tomorrow that can be heard all the way from California to Kennebunkport?
As Mr. Dukakis takes his final message of a snatched victory back and forward across the country, his other recurring theme is the overwhelmingly negative campaign which the Democrats say Mr. Bush has been running. A weekend rally even conjured up the spectre of Richard Nixon in his Watergate days as a symbol of Republican dirty tricks against Mr. Dukakis. The candidate himself put it like this.
The people of this country are fed up with the negativism and the distortions and the lies they've heard now for months from the Bush campaign. This race is about the future. It's about our children and grandchildren. It's about our communities. It's about the future of the world. The best America is not behind us. The best America is yet to come. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Over the past few days, Mr. Bush has been following in his opponent's footsteps round the critical swing states of this election. Yesterday, he contemptuously rejected the charges of lies and distortions, and the sting in the tail was a quote from Harry Truman, the man Mr. Dukakis so much hopes to emulate tomorrow.
All that's left is this daily whining about a negative campaign. Well, let me give the governor a little advice. If he can't stand the heat, he ought to get out of the kitchen.
But it's not only his aggressive side the vice president has been showing in these last days of the campaign. He's been at pains not to seem overconfident, insisting he's running as though he was 10 points behind in the polls.
On November 8th, 100 million Americans will gather to elect the next leader of the free world.
And of course, he's also been playing on his greater experience. The latest Bush campaign commercial is superabundantly presidential.
Tuesday is an important day. Your decision is not so much about the candidates, it's about you. Do you really want to risk going back to high interest rates, high inflation, higher taxes, and higher unemployment? Do you want to go back to the days of military weakness, caring more about criminals than victims? We can't risk that. If you agree with me that we must keep America working and the economy growing, I'd like your vote on Tuesday.
Mr. Bush isn't quite in the same league, perhaps, as the great communicator himself. But Ronald Reagan has been putting on the style to help his vice president follow him into the White House, though Mr. Reagan will obviously regard a Bush victory as a vindication of his own record.
And although, come January, I'm going to be riding off into the sunset, I feel a little like I'm on the ballot myself this year. And if you would, I hope you'll win just one more for the Gipper.
I suppose President Reagan always did have the knack of being in the thick of the political fray while at the same time sounding as though he was above it. But that couldn't be said of Mr. Bush in this campaign. The last 3 weeks have brought daily complaints from the Democrats about the vice president's negative tactics. And in fact, such accusations against Mr. Bush go back as far as the beginning of this year, when he was fighting his fellow Republican, Senator Bob Dole, for his party's nomination as the presidential candidate. Charles Wheeler, who's covered the 1988 campaign from its very earliest days, now reports.
Among the 6 Republicans who entered the race in Iowa, Bob Dole was the favorite to win. He came from a neighboring Midwestern farming state, and as Republican leader in the Senate, he was a nationally known political heavyweight. So, of course, was the vice president. But people wondered about George Bush. Was he his own man, or was he a pliant, subservient, natural number 2 who'd risen to the top by being accommodating to his masters? Many dismissed him in a word: wimp. Erasing that damning description was the first priority of his professional managers, the best team anywhere. Bush would be tough, and would be seen to be tough. And if that meant treading on his rivals on the way up, that was too bad. A man had to win. Things quickly became personal when the Bush camp issued a press release accusing Dole of ignoring the plight of the old and the poor.
If some are desperate and some are panicky, they're going to get pretty nasty. And while they talk about taking the high road, they're going to be right in the gutter. Some of us have records and some of us don't have records, and those who don't have records have to resort to other tactics. And the campaign of fear and a negative campaign. Either George Bush is responsible for this kind of campaigning, or he's totally out of control. And if that's the kind of White House we can look forward to, this kind of scurrilous, last-minute desperation, tactics, and this is only the first state.
In the event, Dole won Iowa and Bush came only 3rd. The bitterness continued. On to New Hampshire, where the words Republican and conservative are synonymous, where the state collects no income tax, and where Ronald Reagan's popularity still held steady at 80%. For George Bush, New Hampshire was crucial. 2 defeats in succession would have destroyed his candidacy.
You know, I haven't been as open in talking about myself as much as I think maybe I have to do. I think that's part of it. And then also, when you're vice president, you're standing there supporting the president of the United States. And I'm not sure that's a great asset in every state, but I have peace of mind. I know it's the right thing to do. And so, come on, who's panicking? We've just begun to fight. Won one, lost one, win the next one.
As vice president, Bush had often campaigned for Republican congressmen. 29 of them now answered the call to repay their political debts.
Okay, gang, let's get going.
Missing a letter. Well, that's all right.
Let's go get those votes for Bush.
Okay.
I left my beautiful wife in sunny California to
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Hi, ladies. Please don't forget to vote on Tuesday, and we appreciate your support for Mr. Bush. I am Congressman Galloway from California.
Good.
Looks like you have all of the goodies for Valentine's Day. Sure hope you look favorably to George Bush. He's going to be our next president.
But Bush's managers were not about to rely on canvassing in shopping centers. They had a better idea. Attack their only serious opponent, Senator Dole. Go for the chink in Dole's armor, taxes. For Dole had refused to rule out an increase in taxes as a partial answer to the deficit. So Bush bought television time and drastically oversimplified Dole's position.
My closest opponent, Senator Dole, says he believes in our revolution. But he said over and over again that he'd raise taxes by backing an oil import fee. And he hasn't ruled out other taxes. Senator Dole is a popular and respected figure in Washington. But that's where the pressure is most intense to repudiate Reaganism with a tax hike. Senator Dole is also a major backer of the National Economic Commission. That commission was Mario Cuomo's idea. It's supposed to tell us what to do about the deficit. Let me tell you something. It exists to provide political cover for a tax hike. If it doesn't recommend a tax increase, I'll not only eat my hat, I'll eat Bob Dole's hat.
The attack continued in a New Hampshire debate where a Republican outsider, Pierre DuPont, challenged Dole on taxes.
I brought with me a copy of the pledge that people take here in New Hampshire not to raise taxes. You're one of the few candidates that hasn't signed it. Sign it. Well, I want to hear if he's going to sign it.
Well, wait a minute. I never signed it. I'd have to read it first. You know, maybe George.
It's not to raise taxes.
Whether the tax issue was decisive, no one will ever know. On the stump, Bush had looked defeated. His photo opportunities were greeted with derision, and by polling day, even his managers expected him to lose.
Hey, come on. Come on, man.
Everyone was wrong. Bush won comfortably.
Tonight, I somehow feel that I have a lot in common with Mark Twain. Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated.
This guy was down and out in Beverly Hills 8 days ago. Lost Iowa big. It was bad. This guy picked himself back up and came in here and smashed his way through this thing. You know these books, every year they write a book on the campaign, making it the president, marathon, and this, that, and the other. This kind of thing, there'll be 2 or 3 chapters in the book this year. This was unbelievable.
Mr. Vice President, if you look right down at that monitor, you'll see the man that you beat tonight. That's Senator Bob Dole, who is standing by in his headquarters. Anything you'd like to say to him at this point?
No, just wish him well and meet him in the South.
And Senator Dole, is there anything you'd like to say to the Vice President?
Yeah, stop lying about my record. We came in here very positive. We talked about the issues, talked about making a difference. And over the weekend, we've had all these negative ads saying Bob Dole wants to raise your taxes. Bob Dole's going to impose a $10 barrel import fee. And that isn't true. I mean, I don't mind being attacked on my record where we have a difference. I mean, just right out, flat out distort the record, then I think we need to call attention to that.
Next, the South. Bush and Dole now had 18 clear days to campaign in 18 states, which were to vote on a single day. The Super Tuesday primaries could only be fought on television. For Bob Dole, Super Tuesday was too high a hurdle. His commitments in the Senate had kept him there too long. He had no real organization and not enough money. And he lost every state to Bush.
Hey, nice to see you.
After only a month of campaigning, Bush became his party's choice for president, a remarkable achievement. But it leaves a nagging question. Did Bush survive New Hampshire by using against Bob Dole the tactics of distortion he was later to use with such devastating effect against Dukakis? Curiously, no one now seems to remember that brief but abrasive battle between the Republicans. They're much too busy lamenting the nature of the autumn campaign. I talked about that to William Schneider of the Conservative American Enterprise Institute and Bob Beckel, who was manager of the losing Walter Mondale campaign in 1984.
Looking back over all the campaigns I've been involved in, this has probably been the most disappointing campaign. It's lacked issues, it's lacked excitement, it's lacked compassion. And I think what worries me about this campaign is it may be a forerunner for future campaigns in the United States.
I fear that the lesson that will be learned from this campaign is a very simple one. Negative campaigns work. Enormous numbers of politicians, consultants, journalists, media specialists will all draw that conclusion. The voters don't like it, the candidates don't like it, the press doesn't like it, but it works, and it's going to be used again and again and again until it can be proved conclusively that it doesn't work.
But George Bush has been the worst offender by common consent. Will his campaign hurt him as president?
Well, I think there's a bitter taste in a lot of voters and politicians' mouths about the kind of campaign Bush has run. He claims the Democrats started it, by the way. It's become a childish game of saying who started it. The Democrats, after all, ridiculed Bush at their national convention. Where was George? The silver foot in his mouth.
But it went beyond ridicule, his campaign. There was distortion on the Bush side.
Well, I think
on questions like crime.
I think that on some issues they were very selective and I think distorting in the way they presented the issues. The issues they chose were not what Americans usually think of presidential caliber issues, dealing with the American Civil Liberties Union, the Pledge of Allegiance, prisoner furlough programs. This is not what electing the leader of the free world is supposed to be all about. I think a lot of Democrats are bitter about this.
You talk about the lack of a mandate for Bush. What's he got a mandate on? The only thing he can go to the Congress of the United States and say is, you know, I've won 40 states and I've got a mandate. And the Congress is going to say, you don't have a mandate. Dukakis lost 40, you didn't win 40. So that's a real problem for him. And I'll tell you, the Congress is waiting for him, just waiting. They didn't like Bush to begin with, but I think they're just going to absolutely destroy him. He readily sends the first conservative judge up to be confirmed. You're going to see a fight like you've never seen before. And they're going to pick a fight with him early on in the Congress. They're going to look for an opportunity to take Bush on and beat him and send him a signal that this is going to be a rough 4 years.
Well, Charles Wheeler is with me in the studio now. Charles, do you think that this negative campaigning by Mr. Bush has helped to effect that improvement by Mr. Dukakis in at least one of the opinion polls?
I think Dukakis' counterattack has, yes. It came very late. The point is that anything coherent at this stage of the campaign from Dukakis would be a change, and this was a nice, coherent, simple issue. Also, he seized on a theme that synchronized with the feelings of the electorate, who were pretty fed up with the campaign and was saying so, and he seized on a theme that got him a lot of support in the press, which I think was feeling guilty because it hadn't attacked the Bush campaign style early enough. So yes, I think it's helped him, but I don't think it's the only factor.
Will it be enough to help him into the White House, though?
No.
What do you think is going to happen? How do you read the opinion polls, for example?
Well, I don't trust them because they're too far apart. And because I think the opinion polls are terribly misleading when people are talking about the popular vote. What you've got to do is to look for the electoral vote, state by state, and add those up, and you come to a different result. This 5-point gap, let's give you an example. In 1968, that was the Nixon-Humphrey election, my first, the one I covered first. Humphrey narrowed the gap to 0.7 on polling day. And what happened? Nixon won by 100 electoral votes. And then in 1976, the Carter-Ford election, the gap came down to 2 points. Carter won by 57 electoral votes. So it all depends what states you win. And there is no evidence. I talked to the pollster who produced this 5-point gap. He told me today there was no evidence which would lead him to suppose that Dukakis could put it together, though obviously in theory it could happen.
So even this best rating, so to speak, so far from Mr. Dukakis of a 5% lead for Mr. Bush is still enough to put Mr. Bush comfortably in.
6% could give Bush a landslide. That's how it works in this country. It's the winner-take-all principle. So these polls really don't mean much. You've got to wait.
Charles Wheeler, thanks very much indeed. Well, we'll have more from Washington tomorrow night when, among other things, we'll be talking to the pollster who predicted the Ronald Reagan landslide of 1980 exclusively here on Newsnight. Now it's back to Gavin in London.
Thanks, Donald. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nigel Lawson, has strongly denied weekend newspaper reports that he's been examining ways of cutting benefits to better-off pensioners. The reports were written after Mr. Lawson himself had on Friday briefed lobby correspondents after his annual autumn statement. This afternoon, Mr. Lawson said they'd got it all wrong. In a heated exchange in the House of Commons, he said the reports bore no relation whatsoever to what he'd said. In fact, he'd been examining ways of finding new money to help poorer pensioners. But as Rupert Seeger reports, the incident could well throw light on Mr. Lawson's continued determination to reform the tax and benefit system.
The story began here at number 11 Downing Street on Friday afternoon. The Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, had invited a number of journalists from the Sunday papers to a lobby meeting. The lobby is Fleet Street and the government at its cosiest. And even though the journalists couldn't quote Mr. Lawson directly, they were convinced they'd come away with a front-page story. The headline said it all. There would be a means test for pensioners. For while the basic pension would remain sacrosanct, it was reported that other benefits were under threat. The £10 Christmas bonus might not be paid to all. Only the poorest pensioners would be exempt from prescription charges, and there was a question mark over the extra money paid automatically to the over 80s. The money that was saved, said the reports, would be targeted on the needy. This proposal caused a political storm. The row reached its peak this afternoon in the House of Commons during an emergency question to the Chancellor. He denied the newspaper reports and was quick to point out that existing benefits would be preserved. The idea was to find extra money for the worse off.
I have been discussing with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Social Security, a scheme to give special help to poorer pensioners. This would be over and above the existing level of benefits.
But the Leader of the Opposition remained unconvinced.
Will he now acknowledge that such a policy inevitably brings a more means-tested system and inevitably brings the creation of a wider poverty trap?
The only change I have to inform the House of is the one that I have informed the House of today. This is a matter which I hinted to certain journalists on Friday. They misunderstood what I was saying, and as a result went in for a farrago of invention.
My reaction to that is that it's a farrago from the Chancellor. 10 of us left that briefing on Friday morning, all of us believing that the Chancellor had told us something about benefits for the pensioners, and all of us read pretty similar stories as a result. All I can say is that there was no question in any of the remarks the Chancellor made that he was talking about finding extra money for the pensioners as a whole. The clear implication of the remarks, and you really need to see them in the context of the rest of his remarks, was that he would favour some system whereby that money was redistributed from wealthy pensioners and targeted more on the people who need it.
Given these claims, it's not surprising that there were reports of a split between John Moore, the Social Security Secretary, and the Chancellor. But this afternoon, Mr Moore threw his weight behind Mr Lawson. Targeting funds on the poor wouldn't mean taking money away from pensioners who are better off.
No, it just isn't true. What we're talking about is not the present arrangements for pensioners, all of which have been quite successful and will continue. It's what extra, what on top of that we can do, and I've been thinking for some while, and I'm looking very carefully, at ways on top of the present system of trying to help those pensioners who are poorer. And if we can do that, I think most people would think that's a very good idea.
But tonight, Labour's Treasury spokesman, Gordon Brown, was still insisting that the government was not coming clean about its intentions.
It's quite clear from what he said in the House that there is a hidden agenda still in the Treasury. He was unprepared or unwilling to answer questions about whether free prescriptions would stay, whether new health service charges would be introduced, whether the attendance and mobility allowance would be means tested. And he gave us no satisfactory explanation of why on the Friday he should be proposing means testing, and on the Monday he should be suggesting there was nothing in it.
But within the past hour, the Chancellor, talking live on BBC One's Panorama programme, denied once again that he intended to introduce a means test for existing benefits. Instead, he said he hoped to provide extra money for some elderly pensioners.
Final details have not been worked out, but it will obviously be the older pensioners who tend to benefit most from this, not least because they retired before the SERPS, the State Earnings Related Pension Supplement, which is now worth an extra £25 a week to a pensioner retiring now. They retired before that existed, and they also retired before occupational pensioners. Occupational pensions were as fully available as they are today, so that it will tend to be the older pensioners who benefit from this.
Tonight, the occupant of number 11 appears to be the pensioner's friend, no longer accused of wanting to steal money from the elderly. At Westminster, however, there's some surprise at the way this announcement has been made. It's assumed to have been brought forward as the result of political pressure. The source of that pressure, the reports that dominated the headlines in Sunday's papers. But the journalist said the Chancellor had simply got it wrong.
Well, joining me now is Peter Jenkins, the political columnist on The Independent. Peter, what's really behind this story? The Chancellor clearly feels very hard done by that the lobby got it wrong.
Well, I don't know what he said because I wasn't there. Perhaps they saw, like in the cartoon, a balloon coming out of his head with thinks. But one thing we can be fairly certain of, and that is that Chancellors of the Exchequer don't go out looking for old age pensioners to help across the road. And one thing which is common ground is that he had been in continuing conversation with John Moore. Now, if that was going on with the expenditure review formally and officially supposed to be completed, I assumed that there was a loose end there to be tied up. I assumed that John Moore was asking for money, and the terms on which that money was to be provided was still under negotiation. It would be the Chancellor's job to drive a bargain on behalf of the Treasury in settling those terms.
But even so, what evidence is there of any kind of hidden agenda from the Chancellor or anyone else, given that ministers will obviously meet and discuss policy options for the future, even if they later discount them?
Well, that's right. He doesn't need a hidden agenda, because the government has an open agenda. The government's open agenda is to target benefits. Now, it may well be, and this is what Mr. Lawson said on Panorama this evening, that journalists, when they heard him use the word target, immediately assumed that targeting involved taking money away from one lot to give it to another. And on this occasion, or so he now says, it didn't. So that's possible. But, I mean, open agenda also because you can go back to 1982 when The Economist leaked the famous report of the think tank. And it's always been in the background of this government to try and to reduce the expenditure on the welfare state by one means or another.
What impact, if any, will this have on tomorrow's debate in the Lords, discussion in the Lords of dental health charges?
Well, it may not have very much impact, other than to reinforce some people, I suppose, will be reinforced in their belief that the government is not to be trusted to look after old age pensioners. But, you know, having said that, you have to be very clear about one thing, which is that on lots of these things, the government is quite clearly pledged not to do the sort of things which it might like to do. And so when you're looking for things that it might do, you have to look for things in which it is not pledged. And I think this is what the Sunday lobby correspondents did after their meeting with Mr. Lawson.
Finally and briefly, Frank Field, the Labour MP, said in the Commons today that this was a gift for Labour which could win them the next general election. Or, alternatively, could this just be a weekend wonder?
No, I think the Chancellor and the lobby correspondents between them have given the Labour Party a pretty good stick to beat the Chancellor with, and they'll go on beating him with it for a bit.
Peter, there we must leave it. Thank you very much. We'll now look at the rest of today's main news stories. Thousands of civil servants throughout Britain have staged a one-day strike against the government's decision to sack trade union members at the GCHQ Communications Centre in Cheltenham. The strike action caused disruption at government offices, prisons, ports, airports and courts. The opposition leader Neil Kinnock told a rally in London that a Labour government would restore trade unions at GCHQ. Referring to Mrs Thatcher's visit to Poland, Mr Kinnock said union rights were as important at GCHQ as they were for solidarity in Gdansk. It's now known that at least 600 people were killed in yesterday's earthquake in southwest China. The earthquake, measuring 7.6 on the Richter scale, hit a mountainous area in Yunnan province near the districts of Lancang and Menglian. The French railway authorities have blamed a points failure for yesterday's train crash near the town of Epernay, in which 9 railway workers were killed. The express train from Luxembourg to Paris was carrying 400 passengers when it collided with a repair wagon in thick fog. The commander of the Israeli-backed Christian militia in southern Lebanon, General Antoine Lad, has tonight been wounded in an assassination attempt. General Lad, who is the head of the South Lebanon Army, was shot in the arm by a Lebanese woman. Earlier in the day, an Israeli soldier was killed in the occupied West Bank. The soldier was stabbed by a Palestinian who was then shot dead. A Bolton school has become the first comprehensive to opt out of council control. An overwhelming majority of parents at St James's Church of England School were in favour of the scheme. Approval of the application by Education Secretary Kenneth Baker would reverse an earlier decision to close the school. In Moscow, the 71st anniversary of the Russian Revolution has been marked in the traditional way with a military parade in Red Square. But in what appears to have been an effort to tone down the Soviet Union's military image abroad, fewer tanks and missiles were on display than in previous years. Many Western ambassadors attended the parade for the first time since the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan 9 years ago. The Soviet dissident Andrei Sakharov has begun his visit to the United States with a call for the West to support his country's reform program. Dr. Sakharov, who was released from internal exile only 2 years ago, said if Mr. Gorbachev's reforms failed, it would be a catastrophe for humanity. The Prince of Wales has tonight warned that Europe must be vigilant despite the emergence of glasnost in the Soviet Union. Speaking at a banquet in Paris hosted by President Mitterrand, the Prince said that the West needed to be careful of its security until there was true democracy in the Soviet bloc. The Prince and Princess of Wales are on a 4-day visit to France. Well, that's almost all we've got time for tonight, but we've just got time for a quick look at tomorrow's front pages. The Independent has Hurd unveils plan for TV revolution. The Telegraph, Hurd's TV plan for dozens of new services. The Guardian, Hurd cues television revolution. The Times, dozens of TV channels in broadcast revolution. Express, great television revolution. Red card to blackout TV's misfits, says Today. Daily Mail, now it's Nigel the nice guy, the other story of the day. And the Daily Mirror, mugged. An old lady is savaged by a 7-year-old. Well, that's it from Newsnight tonight. We'll be back tomorrow at our regular time of 10:30. From all of us on Newsnight, a very good night.
Tomorrow evening, Radio 4 is starting the series of 1988 Wreath Lectures. Professor Geoffrey Hosking of London University's School of Slavonic and East European Studies will be talking about authority, culture and community in the USSR. And his first lecture is at 8:45 tomorrow on Radio 4. Television's impact on the American presidential elections is the theme in about 3 minutes tonight here on BBC Two, after Bill Giles gives us his late-night weather view.
A very good evening to you. Well, we're going to see a change taking place in the weather over the next 2 or 3 days. The high pressure, which has governed the weather for so long, giving us the fog and frost, is on the way into the continent. We've got no frost risk tonight, but still a fair amount of fog around. But let's have a look at the satellite picture then, because this really sets the scene. And remember, the black clouds are the thick, dark, rain-bearing ones. You can see one out to the west of us at 9 o'clock this morning, and another one giving some pretty nasty heavy showers down over Spain and over Portugal. And through today, there's been a pincer movement, really, with that area beginning to work its way in, and this other unsettled weather coming further up across Spain in towards the Bay of Biscay. Well, the computer picks up the rainfall like that at 6 o'clock this evening, and again the black areas are the wetter areas, and you can see that through the next 24 hours or so we get some rain coming up onto the western side particularly, and then most of that's going to shoot away northwards. It's associated in fact with these fronts. It looks as though that low pressure area could well be bringing some quite heavy rain as we go through later on tomorrow, and then through into Wednesday, up across Ireland, up across Scotland. That'll then push its way up into the North Sea, and then through Wednesday, somewhat drier, brighter weather coming back to all of us. But the high pressure, which has been dominating the scene for so long, by that time will have got right across in towards the Soviet Union, and we'll be pulling the winds in from the south or from the southeast. Well, I've said we have a problem with fog. It's on the eastern side, particularly from Yorkshire down through Lincolnshire, the East Midlands, East Anglia, and then down towards Essex. Even now, as I speak, that is beginning to lift up now. The winds are beginning just to stir up the air a little bit, and so the fog is beginning to lift upon the tops of the hills, and most of that will have gone, I think, by the middle part of the night. Still a little bit of misty weather around with that low cloud sitting on the hills. Further west, no problems as far as mist and fog are concerned. I think too much in the way of wind, and certainly a good deal of cloud pushing in through there as well, and a mild night on the western side. Temperatures just about at their lowest now, around 2 in some places on the eastern side, but then starting to lift up now as that wind starts to freshen up. Tomorrow morning, still a bit dull and misty on the eastern side, but that'll be clearing up. It'll gradually brighten up. I'm not promising you very much in the way of sunshine over most of the eastern areas, central part. The best of the sunshine will be up in northern parts of Scotland and into eastern parts of Scotland as well. Now, no sunshine in the west, a good deal of thick cloud here. Rain coming up particularly over Ireland, getting up into southwest Scotland by the end of the afternoon. And along this fringes of the Irish Sea here, I think that's where you're likely to get most of the rain, perhaps little bits creeping further inland, but most of it over the Irish Sea and over into Ireland as well. A windier day than we've had for some time. The wind's freshening up from the southeast, but still quite warm, 14 Celsius, 57 Fahrenheit. Well, that's it from me. Bye-bye for now.
This is BBC Two. Now, a little later than scheduled, the award-winning documentary on television and the presidency.